Sometimes the biggest tests in life appear when the whole world is watching. Today, every news outlet and social media page is talking about one story: Tyler Perry's huge public donation to Pastor Marvin Winans' church. People are calling it a powerful act of generosity, but at the same time, questions are being asked. Why now? Some see it as a pure act of faith, while others whisper that the timing feels too convenient, especially as Perry's name has quietly been linked to a sensitive lawsuit making headlines. But this story isn't as simple as it sounds. Behind the news, there's another truth, one that's about faith, loyalty, and a promise made in silence. Tyler Perry, a man the world knows for success and storytelling, but few know the battles he fights within. Marvin Winans, a preacher whose voice has healed hearts and built bridges between faith and reality. Between them lies a bond that's deeper than friendship and far away from publicity. So when the world turned his generosity into a headline, perhaps Tyler wasn't trying to make news at all. Maybe he was just keeping a promise he once made quietly in a moment of reflection between himself and God. This story isn't about fame or rumours. It's about how one man's act of faith was misunderstood by the world, and how sometimes the truest intentions are the hardest to see. Before the headlines, before the fame, and before the studios that now carry his name, Tyler Perry was a man simply searching for peace. His journey wasn't born in luxury or fame. It was carved through years of struggle, faith, and endless nights of trying to prove that his purpose was real. He often spoke about how faith guided him when nothing else did. Every film, every story he created carried a message of redemption and hope, because that's what his own life had been about. Perry grew up in a world where pain and faith existed side by side. When doors closed, prayer kept him going. When people doubted him, he found strength in forgiveness. And as his career began to rise, he never forgot the one thing that shaped him the most: his belief that success means nothing if it doesn't help others. That same belief connected him to many spiritual leaders, including Pastor Marvin Winans. Their friendship began years ago when Perry attended one of Winans' sermons during a difficult time in his life. What started as a casual meeting turned into a bond built on shared faith and understanding. Perry often said that Winans' words reminded him of why he began creating stories in the first place, not for fame, but to heal people's hearts through truth. Over the years, Perry quietly supported many faith-based causes, rebuilding churches, funding youth programs, and helping families in crisis, but he rarely spoke about it. For him, giving wasn't about recognition, it was about purpose. So when the world later saw him standing beside Pastor Winans announcing a large donation, many assumed it was a random act of charity. What they didn't know was that this connection had been growing for years, rooted in faith, gratitude, and a deep understanding between two men who had both seen darkness and chosen light. Pastor Marvin Winans had always believed that faith should move beyond the walls of the church. For years, he dreamed of building a place that would not only offer prayers, but also real help to people who were struggling. That dream finally began to take shape when his church announced the launch of a new community outreach centre, a space dedicated to healing, counselling and rebuilding lives. They called it a home for healing. It was meant to be a safe place for families in pain, young people searching for direction, and survivors trying to find their voice again. The entire congregation came together to support it, but everyone knew that such a project needed resources. Something far bigger than what they had. Then came a Sunday no one in that church would ever forget. The morning service began like any other, with music, prayers, and Pastor Winans' gentle words about hope and perseverance. But as the sermon came to an end, a familiar face walked onto the stage. Tyler Perry stood there quiet for a moment before speaking from his heart. He talked about how much Pastor Winans had meant to him, how his words once gave him strength during a time of personal struggle. Then, without any grand build-up, he announced that he would be donating a large sum to help complete a home for healing. The crowd fell silent, not because of the money, but because of the sincerity in his voice. People began to clap. Some even cried. The energy in the room felt different, real, humble, and full of gratitude. News of the donations spread fast. Within hours, videos of the moment were shared everywhere online. Some called it a beautiful act of faith in action. Others called it a surprise that only Tyler Perry could pull off. But as powerful as that moment was, it was just the beginning. Because soon after that celebration, whispers started to grow outside the church walls, and whispers that would change how people saw that act of kindness. At first, the world celebrated Tyler Perry's donation. News anchors praised his generosity, social media was full of admiration, and the church community called it a blessing. But as the applause began to fade, another kind of noise slowly started to rise, the kind that questions everything. A few reporters started connecting dots that weren't really there. They noticed the timing of the donation and compared it to the headlines surrounding a recent lawsuit involving one of Perry's old business associates. It wasn't something directly tied to him, but his name appeared just enough times to spark speculation. And that was all the internet needed. Soon, people began to talk, not about the outreach centre, not about the lives that would be changed, but about whether this donation was just a way to shift attention. Was he trying to clean up his image? Some asked. Or was this just a PR move? Others whispered online. The noise grew louder than the act itself. Within days, what started as a story about kindness turned into one filled with assumptions and rumours. Journalists debated motives, commentators picked sides, and while the world talked, the real purpose behind that moment and faith, gratitude and a promise was lost in the chaos. For Tyler, it was a strange feeling. He had done something straight from the heart, yet people saw it as strategy. The man who had built his career on stories of hope was now being painted as someone who used faith as a cover. And somewhere behind all the headlines and judgment, one simple truth was being ignored. Sometimes a good deed is just that, a good deed. But in a world that feeds on scandal, even faith gets questioned. At first, everything about Tyler Perry's donation felt like a moment of pure goodness. The internet was filled with positivity, people sharing clips of the service, writing about how inspiring it was to see someone at the top of Hollywood still grounded in faith. For a brief moment, it seemed like everyone agreed on something good. But that peace didn't last long. As it often happens when something shines too bright, people start looking for shadows behind it. Within days, a few online blogs and media outlets began to focus on one detail: the timing. They noticed how the donation came just as whispers were spreading about a lawsuit involving someone who had once worked with Perry years ago. The lawsuit had nothing to do with Tyler directly. His name appeared only in passing, a small mention buried inside legal documents. But for some people online, that was enough. They began building a story that didn't exist, connecting events that were never connected. Suddenly, social media was divided. On one side, people defended Perry, saying he had always been generous and didn't need to prove his kindness to anyone. On the other side, there were voices claiming the donation was just a distraction, a way to control the narrative. Comments flooded every post. Memes were made. Talk shows picked it up. The headlines grew sharper by the hour. Tyler Perry's faith or strategy? Donation or diversion? Good deed or good PR? It was the same cycle that often happens in the world of fame, where a kind act becomes a headline and a headline becomes controversy. For Tyler, it felt like a familiar kind of pain, the kind that comes from being misunderstood. He had seen it before. He had felt it before. And even though he had lived most of his adult life in the public eye, this time it cut deeper. Because this wasn't about a movie or a business deal. This was about faith, something sacred, something personal. In quiet moments, he wondered how the world had become so suspicious of kindness. How something as simple as helping a church could be turned into a debate about motives. He didn't speak publicly about it. He didn't post long statements or explanations. Instead, he stayed silent, letting the noise fade on its own. But even in silence, the weight of judgment was heavy. Friends called to check on him. Pastor Winans assured him that the truth always reveals itself in time. Yet deep down, Tyler couldn't help but feel that his faith had been tested, not by the lawsuit, but by the way the world reacted to something pure. Because when the world doubts goodness, it's not just the giver who hurts. It's the idea of faith itself that gets bruised. When the noise outside grew too loud, Tyler Perry did what he always did. He went quiet. He stepped away from the cameras, the interviews, and the conversations happening about him. For the first time in months, his mansion felt less like home and more like a shelter, a place to breathe and think. Late at night, when the city was asleep, Tyler would sit alone in the small prayer room he had built years ago. It wasn't grand or luxurious. Just a quiet space with a cross on the wall, a single candle, and an old Bible resting on the table. It was here, away from everyone's eyes, that he found peace again. He thought about how strange it was, how something done out of love could be twisted into something else. He had promised God long ago that if he ever found success, he would use it to help others. That promise was what had led him to Pastor Winans' church, not a lawsuit or a headline. As he sat there, he remembered a conversation he once had with Pastor Winans years before. It was during one of the darkest times in his life when he had lost faith in people and almost in himself. Winans had told him something simple yet powerful. When the world misunderstands you, don't rush to defend yourself. Just keep walking in truth. Time is the loudest voice of all. Those words echoed in his mind now. And in that silence, Tyler realised something important. Not everyone would understand his heart, and maybe they didn't need to. Still, the weight of the rumours hurt. There's a special kind of pain that comes when good intentions are questioned. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't even want to clear his name. He just wanted peace, the kind of peace that doesn't depend on what people believe. In those quiet nights, he prayed, not for himself, but for everyone involved, for the people who doubted him, for the ones who stood by him, and for those who were truly suffering in the world. He prayed for strength to stay humble and faithful, even when faith felt heavy. And little by little, as the days passed, that peace began to return. The noise outside didn't stop, but inside he was calm again. He reminded himself that truth doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it only needs patience. Because when you act out of faith, even if the world misunderstands you, God never does. While the media continued to discuss the story, Pastor Marvin Winans stayed quiet for a while. He wasn't interested in chasing rumours or trying to control the narrative. He believed that sometimes silence speaks louder than explanations. But as the noise around Tyler Perry's donation grew, he felt it was time to remind people what the real story was. Not about fame, but about faith. One Sunday morning, Pastor Winans stood before his congregation with a calm smile. The church was full, as it always was, but the air felt heavier that day. Everyone had heard the rumours. Everyone was waiting to hear what he would say. He began softly, not with anger or defence, but with gratitude. He said, "People have their opinions, and that's all right, but faith doesn't need perfect timing. It just needs truth. When someone gives from the heart, the world might question it, but God never does." He didn't mention Tyler's name at first. Instead, he talked about the power of giving, how true generosity comes from private promises, not public applause. Then he turned his message toward the new outreach centre, a home for healing. He reminded everyone why it existed, for the people who had been broken, hurt and left behind. In the weeks that followed, the church began sharing small updates about the project. Videos appeared online showing construction work starting, volunteers helping, and families signing up for programs. The donations, including Tyler's, were already changing lives, providing food, therapy, and education to those who had lost hope. Slowly, the conversation started to shift. The same people who had once doubted the act began to see its real impact. A mother who received help from the church shared her story online, thanking both Pastor Winans and Tyler Perry for giving her a second chance. Others began to speak up too. Community leaders, youth mentors, and even people who had never stepped foot inside a church before. The world saw something it couldn't deny. Real change. No headlines, no drama, just results. Tyler never said a word publicly during this time, but people noticed. His silence became its own statement, and calm, respectful and firm. And as the outreach centre finally opened its doors, Pastor Winans dedicated the first day to everyone who believes in doing good, even when it's misunderstood. The applause that day wasn't for Tyler Perry. It wasn't even for the church. It was for the simple truth that faith, when it's real, always finds its way through the noise. Weeks passed, and the noise that once filled the internet slowly disappeared. The world had moved on to new stories, new controversies and new distractions, as it always does. But inside that small community in Detroit, something far more lasting had begun. The outreach centre, a home for healing, was alive. Families were coming in every day. Children were laughing in rooms that had once been empty. Volunteers worked late into the night, helping strangers become whole again. Tyler Perry watched from a distance. He didn't attend the grand opening and he didn't release any statement. But one quiet Sunday morning, he drove to the church alone. There were no cameras, no security, no press, just him. He sat in the back row while the choir sang. No one noticed him at first, and that's exactly how he wanted it. As Pastor Winans spoke about gratitude and staying faithful through storms, Tyler bowed his head. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace without pressure. No headlines, no noise, just silence and a deep sense of purpose. After the service ended, he walked to the front where Pastor Winans stood. They exchanged a small smile. No words needed. It wasn't about the donation anymore. It was about two men who had kept faith alive in a world that often forgot what it meant. When Tyler stepped back outside, the sky was clear, the air calm. He took a deep breath and felt something he hadn't in weeks. Relief. Not because the rumours were gone, but because the truth had quietly done its work. People would forget the noise, but they would remember what had been built. That was enough for him. In the end, the story that started with doubt ended with quiet redemption. Tyler had learned that you don't have to prove your faith. You just have to live it. Because real acts of goodness don't need attention. They just need intention. And sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones the world sees. They're the ones that happen when no one's watching.